You can start a journal, but it gets aborted in the third year. As a gynecologist. This is the problem. You start an institution, very well started, after the third or the fourth year it starts declining, in a decade it disappears for various reasons. Economic, political, social. The Kyoto school I mentioned has got three main objectives. One, a thoroughgoing loyalty to its own tradition. A thoroughgoing loyalty to its own tradition. Don't ignore the tradition. We should not ignore our tradition. To the extent that we are interested in Russell and Wittgenstein and Strawson and my own teacher at Stanford, Davidson, equally with the same vigor we must be interested in our own loyalty, our tradition. I made myself clear when I went to Stanford. I didn't go to study Vedanta with Davidson. I go there to study about the recent trends in Western philosophy, not to study Vedanta. I had the training. Thoroughgoing loyalty to our tradition. A committed openness to the Western traditions. Keep an open mind. Check with what is taking place in that tradition. Because this question again was asked, is there anything new? I said, yes, there is new. But the new is in the old. This is what I say as a slogan. The new trends that we are familiar with today in the West, all those trends can be identified in the Indian classical tradition. The new in the old, the new trends like phenomenology, linguistic analysis, postmodernism, enlightenment project, post-enlightenment, postmodernism, deconstruction. What is known as Heidegger, beyond ontotheology. Yes, beyond ontotheology for us. The only thing is, because our tradition is not restricted to only one particular area, multifarious. Multifarious. So, an interest to find out what is taking place elsewhere, you should not ignore that one. Third, according to Kyoto school, a synthesis of East and West. That is good where it is possible. But where it is not possible, we should not, in the name of synthesis, make an amalgamation such that we lose our identity. That is not helpful. Synthesis in the sense, namely, that try to understand in terms of modern terminology our own traditional concepts. A concept can be renamed. We use a terminology traditionally. Supposing we use the term pramana vichara, I can say it is epistemological inquiry. Pramana vichara is inquiry into the sources of knowledge. Axiology, it is the purushartha vichara. We have been doing that one. Different purusharthas, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Analysis we do. Shankara, what a great man. Shankara, before writing his commentary on the Taittiriya Upanishad, because Taittiriya Upanishad is older than Shankara, he is writing a commentary on the Taittiriya Upanishad. He tells the reader what is the methodology he is following in writing the commentary on the Upanishads, on the Taittiriya Upanishad. He should have a methodology. He spells out. He says he is paying attention to pada, Vakya and Pramana. He pays attention to Pada. Pada is word. Vakya, sentence. Pramana, sources of knowledge. So I am looking at this text, Taittiriya Upanishadic text. By applying these three important principles, I pay attention to the words, the padas. To pay attention to a word, to find out its meaning, different meanings, that is what is called today in the West as semantics. Linguistics in India, linguistics elsewhere, they speak about semantics. Padavichara is a semantics. When they say that the West is interested in semantics, we think, it's wonderful. It is wonderful, it's not something new. Vakya Vichara. You know that if you go to the great acharyas of Shankara tradition or the Vaishnava tradition, annually they have what is called Vakyartha Vichara. The traditional scholars come belonging to different branches. They are engaged in what is called Vakyartha Vichara. Vakyartha. Somebody will be asked to take up a particular context. There are sentences, problems, and then you explain the position. Others are there to question that one. I don't know whether you have occasion to see that one. The debate is in Sanskrit. Of course, unless you know some background, you won't be able to follow. So there is the Vakya Vichara. Vakya Vichara is what we call syntax, the agreement between the subject and the verb. The subject part of a sentence, the predicate part of a sentence, how to construe. Sometimes the verb may be missing, elliptical, you supply. Supposing I just say fire, just one word, that means there is fire here. So this is syntax is a Western one. Why Western? How old is Shankara? Even if you accept what the Indologists have got to say at the 7th century end, doesn't matter. But he says that I am only following my own predecessors in that tradition. Shankara says, I am not for the first time doing this one. I just follow in the footsteps of great masters who have exercised the same methodology, Pada, Vakya, Pramana, Vichara. Then Pramana. Pramana is inquiry into the sources of knowledge. And you get a total philosophy, semantics, syntax, and pragmatics. What is the purpose of the whole exercise? Why do you indulge in this type of intellectual exercise? What is the result? That is the pragmatics. Carnap says, the great master Carnap, analytical philosophy of science, that all these three branches are very important. Semantics, syntax, pragmatics. Okay. It's not new to us. We have done that. Here is the sentence of Shankara. How he cares for all the nuances connected with Pada, Vakya, Pramana. Why don't you study Shankara and then put Carnap by the side of Shankara? This is an old master, this is a new thinker. I don't want to say we can poo-poo Carnap. No, accept him. But you are interested in teaching Carnap and others, saying that this is something new. That the drill goes on. And then that one minority in the department who is doing Indian philosophy, he is marginalized, and students go to other people. He is teaching only Indian philosophy. It's a shame. Kyoto school. Why don't we follow Kyoto school? I'm not, because I myself have been in a department. I know what has happened, how we require a kind of a revolutionization with regard to even the teachings of even the Western courses. If I spill over the time, you just permit me. I can't speak like that everywhere. I can speak only in a place where the audience is receptive and the organizers are willing. If they just look at the time and then say, just next memorial lecture will be a year later. Wait. I wish I am 20 years young. I am not. I completed 78. Nearing 79, I will complete it. Now, thank you. Now, before I take up some of the new trends, we have to know what is generally called, this is a term that has been used but not nowadays, perennial philosophy. Perennial philosophy. Sanatana Dharma I translate as perennial. Sanatana is perennial, eternal. Dharma, not in the restricted sense. Dharma is a very comprehensive term. A word which cannot be translated in any other language so easily. It means ethics, it means religion, it means ritual, it means good conduct, it means a principle which sustains the entire society. Dharyate anena iti dharmaha. Dharyate iti. Dharayati iti. That which sustains society is dharma. Society in a larger sense. That which sustains the entire world is dharma. So, what is it that sustains the entire world? It is Brahman. So, another word, well, Shankara in the Brihadaranyaka Bhashyaka says that dharma means a Brahman. Brahman means dharma. Because it is Brahman which creates the world, sustains the world. That is dharma. So Sanatana Dharma means eternal dharma, eternal philosophy, perennial philosophy. This is a term that was used for the first time by Huxley. It caught the imagination of the people. Oh, wonderful term. And unlike other philosophical systems, in India, we have what is called the Sanatana Dharma or perennial philosophy, total philosophy, eternal philosophy, not fragmented philosophy. We must take together the total one. You may wonder how it is possible for us to take a total philosophy. I give an example. All of us are familiar with Taittiriya Upanishad. Usually, it is one of the Upanishads which is chanted frequently on all the auspicious occasions. There are 3 chapters in that book. The first chapter is Sikshavalli, about moral practices and all that one. It is there. You have got that famous convocation address. Satyam Vadat, Dharmam Chara. This, all that. The second chapter is called Brahmanandavalli. It is inquiry about Brahman. And all the analysis is there. The third chapter, Bhruguvalli, where the father gives the instruction to the son. Varuna, the father, gives instruction to the son Bhrigu. Method of inquiry. That means, first, it is a kind of a moral and practical discipline. One should be in a position mentally to listen to the discussion. What is called today in American universities as course requirement. Supposing I take up want to do a course on set theory. Set theory. They say, no, you can't do that one unless you do a basic course in mathematics, symbolic logic, formal logic. Do first that one semester. Then you can come for the advanced course, set theory. I want to do something connected with the phenomenology, you do this first of all. Then you come to that. What they call course requirement. Similarly, there is such a thing called the course requirement. What is the point in studying about Brahmananda Vallis and then give the definition? Brahma vidapnoti param atyajnanam anantam Brahma, all mere statements. Are you in a mental set to listen to the discussion? Have you that eligibility? If you don't have that eligibility, not to read alone, but something more. If you have that one, then you are fit to go to the second one. So first, Shikshavalli is the moral and practical discipline. It's followed by the enunciation of the philosophy. This is the nature of Brahman. This is yourself, how you are, your composition, Panchakosas and all that one. And then gradually it then goes into, the student is not satisfied. And then the teacher tells the student, the father himself is a teacher, he tells the student, look here, then you have to inquire into that one. I give you a definition, you come up with your answer. First answer, second answer, third answer, fourth answer, like that it goes on. It is something like the teacher giving an assignment and then he has to do that one. You must take the entire book. You should not isolate a passage and say, I am trying to read this one, I don't understand. You won't understand at all. Because you have picked up one sentence and then you won't analyze that one. Why don't you begin from the beginning? Sir, I don't have the time. Would you say that when you register for a course in American university? You will not be given registration at all. There is such a thing called academic respectability. Before you join the department, there is an academic supervisor for you. Everybody has got an academic supervisor. He decides what courses you will have, what courses you will not have. He decides for you. Here the parent will object, why should he decide? He wants to study. The whole thing is a topsy-turvy. So there is such a thing called perennial philosophy. And then I have identified basic doctrines of perennial philosophy. Perennial philosophy admits what is known as theory of levels. This is one level of reality, another level of reality, the third level of reality. This is empirical reality. There is something more than that. There is something more than that. And then you begin to question, how is it that there could be something more than that? That is what you have to study. I know I make a deviation. This is in Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. Hamlet and Horatio with his friend Horatio, they go up because the ghost of Hamlet's father commanded him to come to that place. So with his friend he goes there. At a particular stage he asks Horatio to stay back. I have to go alone. So Horatio stays back and then Hamlet goes forward. And then there is the encounter with the spirit of his father. And then he comes back. What transpired we don't know. He comes back. Horatio, his friend, asks him, what is the matter? What did the spirit of your father tell you? Hamlet did not answer the question completely. He just made one statement. There are more things in heaven and the earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. There are more things in heaven and the earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. That is in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Hamlet context, Hamlet tells his friend Horatio, and then silences him. Don't ask me further. Parishio did not question him. There is some problem, he knows. And that is exactly the case here. That is what Wittgenstein wanted to convey. What cannot be spoken about can only be shown. That is what our mystics in our tradition say. In Tamil we put it this way, Kandavar Vindilar. Those who are seen, they cannot speak about. Kandavar, those who are seen, Vindilar, they cannot speak about. That is Hamlet. Here is Wittgenstein. This is our tradition. And in the perennial philosophy, there is a place for everything. Nothing is outside the whole. The total picture is there. Everything has got a place. Nothing is out of place. And everything is relative to the absolute. That is the core principle. And everything is in the periphery, in the circumference, related to the whole. And there is room for change. And that is why in the Indian tradition, because reference was made in our conversation, where there was a reference to Swami Dayananda, the founder of the Arya Samaj, how there has been the preservation of the core, the tradition has been preserved, but changes have been brought about. And changes are not incompatible with the traditional view, tradition, the core of the tradition. It remains the same. Changes are taking place. That is possible only in the case of perennial philosophy. So we have got new trends, and one of the new trends that we have in the West today is postmodernism. Postmodernism, I don't want to go into all the details. Postmodernism glorifies diversity, changes in every aspect of our life. And for example, I was asking Dr. Bedekar, I was curious, is this structure remains incomplete? It looks like that. He told you, no, the architect who planned this, he wanted to leave it like that. It was revealing to me, because anybody who looks at it will say, probably it is in the process of construction and he requires more money to complete it. Probably a ceiling should be there and all that one. That is the imagination. I asked him, I was curious. No. Then I said that this is exactly the spirit of postmodernism. They say they don't want to copy the same thing that came kind of a multi-storied complex structure everywhere. You have one blueprint, that is enough. Repeat it everywhere. In architecture, there should be change. In our lifestyle, there should be change. Everything should not be reduced to one principle. I said that this is postmodernism. If anybody who believes in postmodernism would say, yes, it has been put into practice. You could see the conduit pipes and all that one, everything. And in postmodernism, we have got generally two important trends. One is a deconstruction, the other is a phenomenology. There are many things, I just mentioned only these two things, a deconstruction and phenomenology. The word itself, deconstruction, is a little intriguing, mystifying, because we know the literal meaning, construction, deconstruction. This word has been made very popular by Derrida, a French writer, but earlier Heidegger and others, they have used the word. What does the word deconstruction mean? Very in simple explanation, whenever there is a text, written text, nowadays we are having written text. It could be even a oral text, as the Vedas were transmitted orally. They say that the oral text is more authoritative than the written text. Oral text is more authoritative because the Vedas have been transmitted orally with accent and all that one. In the written one, you can't have that one. You can just read that, that's all. The same, today it is recited in the same way in which it was recited 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 100 years ago, 300 years ago, provided the people who teach, they are very good in tradition. In the south, we are very good. We are happy about that. In Tamil Nadu, in Andhra, in Karnataka, in Maharashtra also. Now, a text contains much more than what we say it says. That's why there are different interpretations of the text. Take the case of the Brahma Sutra. It has been interpreted differently by the different acharyas. Therefore, we have got different traditions. In tradition, all the Vedantins except Prasthanatraya, the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutra, and the Bhagavad Gita, all the three. And all the three have been interpreted by Shankara, by Ramanuja, by Madhva, Nimbadka, Vallabha, Chaitanya, and so on. Bhagavad Gita was interpreted by Mahatma Gandhi, Tilak, Sri Aurobindo, and so on. Why is it that there is, if all of them follow the same principles of syntax, semantics, pramanas, then their interpretation should be the same. That is the question that is asked. Why is it that Ramanuja differs from Shankara? Madhva differs from both Shankara and Ramanuja? That is because there is something that is said in the text. There is something that is unsaid in the text. Today, Gadamer and others who are doing hermeneutics, they say, if you take a text, don't think that its meaning has been conveyed once and for all the time. No. The greatness of the text lies in the fact that it goes on giving new meaning from time to time, depending upon the way in which you react to the text. You question the text. The text answers your question. Sometimes, the questions that we frame are loaded, and you understand what I mean by loaded. There is a preconceived notion concealed in the question that I put. Supposing you go to a doctor, this is an example that we give in metaphysics. Walsh gives this example. Supposing you see the skin and you find that there is a scar. Supposing you tell, what is that? It's a scar. The moment I use the word scar, I use it having a particular background. I call it a scar because there must have been a wound, it has been healed, there is a mark left over. There is so much that is conveyed by just using the word scar. When we ask a question, it is already a loaded question. I have some preconceived idea. What I do is, in order to elicit an answer, I put the question. That's why Russell and others says, but you must know how to frame the question. If you frame the question in the wrong way, it cannot be answered. Put the question rightly. And therefore, these people, Gadamer today, he lived for 102 years. He passed away only recently. Gadamer. He says, if you take a text, there is something that is said, that there are many things which are unsaid. And it is from the unsaid which is the source from which others get the inspiration. Shankara looked at the Vedantas in a particular way. Ramanuja in a different way, because he has got a set of different questions. Madhva, another set of questions. That's why the same text which is authoritative is interpreted differently, such that we have Advaita system, Visishtadvaita, Veda, Veda Veda, Achintya Veda Veda, look at that, Veda Veda, Chaitanya Achintya Veda Veda, it goes like that. That means every Acharya, a creative thinker, because we ask the question, is Indian philosophy creative? Already it is a loaded question. He has got the way in which it is put means, one, the questioner has already decided that there is no creativity in Indian philosophy. Already he has decided there is no creativity. It is dead and gone. It has got only antiquarian interest, archival interest. It has to be kept in the archives. You can go and read some of those in the archives. And many years ago in Voltaire, under the leadership of Professor Soundarana and Satchidanandamurthy, a seminar was held. What is living and what is dead in Indian philosophy. Look at that. I felt very unhappy. I was very young at the time. I thought that why should a seminar theme be framed like that? What is living and what is dead in Indian philosophy? That means something is living and many things are dead in Indian philosophy. It's a loaded phrasing of the seminar topic. What is living and what is dead? So, what is dead has to be identified by the scholars assembled there. This is dead, that is dead, that is dead. This alone is living. Nothing is dead. Every organ of Indian philosophy, it is not like the British girl who died in the Goa ghost. Every organ is intact. The only thing is the anatomist and the pathologist, they don't look at the grand organ called Indian philosophy, and therefore they say what is living and what is dead in Indian philosophy. So this kind of a deconstruction has been going on in the Indian tradition. Take Buddha for example. He challenged the Vedic tradition. Not the entire Vedic tradition. He accepted the karma theory. He accepted the theory of rebirth. All that, how the cycle goes on. The problem of ignorance, avidya, he recognized. Remedy is only in enlightenment, he recognized. That is the stock of the Vedic tradition. But he was opposed to the rituals. He was opposed to the metaphysical theories like the heaven, hell, this and that. He was more pragmatic. Problems are here in this world, addressed to be in this world and not to be taken care of in some other space. He was a deconstructionist. The best reconstructionist traditionally we can think of is Buddha. And the Indian tradition provided an important place for Buddha. Buddhism has spread. Then Nagarjuna, take for example, a great dialectician of the Buddhist school. He did his own deconstruction, remaining a Buddhist, saying that every view can be shown to be untenable, every thesis is untenable. If you say X, X is untenable. Non-X, equally untenable. Both X and non-X, equally untenable. Fourth alternative, neither X nor non-X, untenable. Then somebody asked him, what is your thesis then finally? I don't have any thesis to uphold. If you come up with any particular view, any thesis, any position, I will say that it is untenable. You have to go beyond all that. Going beyond all that. A place, a position which gives you security, that safety with Wittgenstein speaks about. A position which is called abhayam, the state of non-fear. Abhayam. O Janaka, you attained, you are no ordinary king. You attain that state. He gives you that assurance. It is that assurance that Nagarjuna wants to suggest by his negative dialectics. He is a deconstructionist. He questioned the tradition, Vedic tradition. Shankara, the great orthodox, he was also a deconstructionist. He makes a distinction between orthodoxy and orthopraxis. Orthodoxy is a traditional orthodox view. Orthopraxis, praxis is the Western word that we always say action. Praxis, praxis, orthopraxis, traditional practice. So traditional theory, traditional practice. It's a high-sounding word, and we use high-sounding word in a seminar or lecture. People think, oh, there seems to be something in the man. Orthodoxy, orthopraxis. Shankara accepted orthodoxy. The orthopraxis contained, the practice contained so many things. Some he accepted, many he rejected. He challenged the Mimamsakas. He learned Mimamsa, he knew Mimamsa, he challenged the Mimamsakas. He says that karma cannot give you liberation. Karma can give you what is called a worldly prosperity. It can give you praise and not shreyas. Praise is worldly prosperity. Here in this world, in other world. We don't know anything about that. We can only quote the authority of scripture, Shastram. Shastram pramanam te karya karya vivastitav. The Lord Krishna, he tells Arjuna, remember, there is such a thing called Shastra. He tells you what you should do and what you should not do. What you should know, what you should not know. What is worth knowing, what is not worth knowing. The word karya, akarya, vivastita, dual number. Shastram pramanam te. For you it is a shastra that is the pramana. He gives the final word. It doesn't mean that other pramanas are not needed. Pratyaksha is needed, anumana is needed. But with regard to karya and akarya, what is to be done? Not with regard to eating. There is a karya I have to do for my living. There are other things deliberately done by the human being as a moral agent. What is it I have to do as a moral agent? What is it I have to do, I should not do as a moral agent? That karya and akarya, with regard to that, it goes beyond the empirical. Something connected with what is trans-empirical. What is the pramana? Shastram pramanam te. Karya karya vivastitav. It's a simple text. How do you understand it? Is Krishna dogmatic when he teaches Arjuna? If you do not know how to interpret a text, well, Krishna is dogmatic. He is just quoting scripture, and then he is threatening Arjuna to say, well, you must do according to Shastra. That is not, you are not doing justice to the text. It speaks to you, you question the text, you don't know how to understand the text. Mere verbal knowledge will not do. And so, Shankara said that no, I won't. Karma has got its utility, but karma is not the means to moksha. Therefore, there is what is called jnana karma discussion. He was a great deconstructionist. Ramanuja was a deconstructionist. He questioned Shankara. He wanted to demolish the entire Advaita structure and build Visishtha Advaita. And in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, on the first sutra, it's the longest commentary that he has written, several pages, because first he must deconstruct the position. Then only he can build his structure. What is standing before him as an obstacle, according to him, is Advaita, that great monolithic structure. He questioned the basic ideas. All that on the basis of scripture. Deconstruction. Madhva did that. Sri Aurobindo did that. Aurobindo, just... Aurobindo wrote his commentary on Isavasya Upanishad, just as Shankara did. It's a very creative mind, a great deconstructionist in modern times. And Sri Aurobindo says in one place, Ishvara laughed at Shankara 3 times, as if Ishvara has no other work. How many times he laughed at Shankara? 3 times. Why? What are the occasions? First, when he started writing the commentary on the Isavasya Upanishad. Oh, what a kind of commentary you write. You don't know. And only Sri Aurobindo knows. Because from the beginning, Isavasyam idam sarvam, from the beginning, he doesn't support Advaita. That is Sri Aurobindo's view. We respect him. But at the same time, he makes a statement, Ishvara laughed at Shankara when he started writing and completing this commentary on Isavasya Upanishad. Okay, on occasion. The second occasion, it was when he undertook Padayatra from place to place, from the south to the north and back to the south. You are advocating Jnana Marga. You should confine yourself to one place, but you have been treading the path. There is no place which has not gone on foot, from Kanyakumari to Kashmir, and to Guwahati side to this side. And you go against your own spirit of philosophy. Karma yogi, you should be in, you are not a karma yogin, you should be you are a jnana yogin. Therefore he laughed. Second time. Third time, he made a promise to his mother when he took sannyasa, and then said that he would go to Narmada site in search of his teacher, Govinda Bhagavad Pada, for formal initiation into becoming a sannyasi. He made a promise to his mother that you will be very much in my mind. I will come back to you during the last moments of your life. So, he was there elsewhere, and when he knew that his mother was passed away, he came back rushing, and then he wanted to do the obsequies for her. It was objected to by the Nambudris who were there. They said, no, you are a sannyasi, you are not qualified to do that kind of a thing. Leave it to others. Shankara said, no, I got it right. He did that. So, being a sannyasi, he did that. That was the third occasion on which Ishvara laughed at Shankara. It may be in a jocular mood. Probably even the great yogis have got sometimes or in a jocular mood. He said, he had a dig at, as we put it, he had a dig at Shankara. The point is, he was a deconstructionist. Wonderful deconstructionist, Sri Aurobindo. One of the past masters in modern English prose. He has got his own style. Just as Milton had that grand style when he wrote that the Paradise Lost. So even so, any person who is interested in first-rate English literature should read Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine. It is elevating. We may agree or may not agree, that's another issue. We don't have to. Everything that he says. There are many things which are very important for us. Why should we ignore the grain, paying attention only to the chaff? Phenomenology and I tell you, I don't go into the details. The whole idea of phenomenology is that everything is to be understood with reference to in terms of consciousness in me. When I say this is a table, the table is an object which I see, which I know. And it is the object of my consciousness. This is an object of my consciousness. Everything in the world is an object of my consciousness. Otherwise I can't speak about anything. Nobody can speak about anything. So, it is giving primacy, a central place to consciousness. I have got a body, the senses, the mind, the vital forces, the mind, different aspects of the mind, and then I go beyond the mind, what is called the self. The self by its very nature is consciousness. It is consciousness and nothing but it is Chaitanya Swarupa, Chetana Swarupa. So it is consciousness that is the animating principle in me. Without consciousness, I am dead. Now, everything has to be understood in terms of consciousness. That is the basic position. This is the position of in Indian tradition, particularly Advaita. There is one book called Drik Drishya Viveka. Drik is the seer, consciousness. The seer, Drishya, objects which are seen. The entire, everything can be brought under these two categories. One is the self, the other is the not self. Drik is the self, consciousness, and the Drishya is objects of consciousness. Objects of consciousness. There cannot be a third entity. Only we have got two entities, Drik and Drishya. Drik is consciousness, Drishya is the objects of consciousness. That is the position. This has been developed in the West by Husserl and his followers. So there is a big movement called phenomenological movement that we accept it. That is the position. Now, I don't go into the detail, I'll just tell you one thing. In recent times in the West, a great medical biologist, also a Nobel laureate, John Eccles, Sir John Eccles, Eccles, a master. He collaborated with Karl Popper in the London School of Economics. Karl Popper is a philosophy of science man. Many books he has written. And the brain, the self, the brain, there is a very big book written by them jointly. Sir John Eccles and Karl Popper. In that book, there is a picture of three, I am just condensing the whole thing. There are three worlds according to Popper and Eccles. World 1, World 2, World 3. There are three worlds. Sometimes they use the word primary world and the secondary world. There is only one primary world, the rest is the secondary world. Which is the primary world, which is the secondary world? Which is world 1, which is world 2, which is world 3? World 1 is the world of consciousness, the world of self. They use the word ego because they don't have the precise terminology which we have. That is an advantage for us. If you look at the Oxford Dictionary or any other dictionary, self, the meaning is given as ego. Ego, the meaning is as with self. Or it is given as the I. The principle, that's all. If you take the term spirit, they try to understand it in a different way. It is a self, this and that. So that means they are trying to operate with the help of, say, let us say, two words, ego and self. And what is consciousness? It's a kind of an awareness in us. The whole issue in that book is that they give, Eccles and Karl Potter gave importance to consciousness as a central principle, in terms of which we have to understand the things of the external world. So, the external world, the world of space, time, causality, that external world is a world too. The primary world is the world of the self, consciousness or ego. And the brain is the liaison between world one, the individual, and the world two. How it functions is a mystery. We can't go into the details. Even scientists, they don't do that. Then what is world three? The world of culture. So they put the world one, the world of consciousness in the center, and the external world of space and time as world two, outside this one but related to consciousness. The world of culture again related to consciousness. Now, the world of culture is not the creation of any human being. I have inherited that one. I am a product to the world of culture, and I also transmit that to the future. I am shaped by that one. I also, in my own way, make changes in that world of culture and contribute it to the future generation. And the world of culture is something unique only to human beings. Whatever may be the achievements of the animal world, what is called a culture, the world of culture is intimately associated with the human beings, past, present, and the future. This is what the scientists have got to say. Sir John Eccles is a medical biologist, a Nobel laureate, not because it comes from John Eccles and Karl Potter, but because that is the central position in the Indian tradition. For that, you take that small text, Drisya Viveka, read that. And the Upanishads, this has been explored. Tomorrow we will take it up in the Mandukya Upanishad, for example. How important is this consciousness is in the life of a person. So, we have got phenomenology, and then we have also what is called going beyond metaphysics, going beyond the theology. There is something which goes beyond all that. That is a mystical position. Even that has been developed. Now they are talking about in the West also. I conclude now by saying that our tradition is very rich. Because it is rich, it doesn't mean that we can be satisfied with that and then do nothing. To preserve that, we must make efforts. And to understand its value, it's necessary that we keep an open mind and see what is taking place elsewhere, either in the Western tradition or in the other places in the Eastern tradition. Therefore, all the time we can compare and say, look at that picture, look at this picture, look at some other picture. This comparative approach will not dilute our tradition. On the contrary, I am convinced that it will help us to better appreciate our tradition and also contribute towards that. And I am happy that this memorial lecture gave me an occasion to recollect many things. I am doing that, I am interested in that. I want you to take interest, academics and non-academics, to take interest in our Indian tradition. It is not something that sits loosely on you occasionally. We think that that is what tradition says. But there is something. And why should we not try to understand that something? It is not the mere dress. Doesn't matter. They are all periphery. Your dress, changes in the dress, changes in your... all that is not going to affect the substantial aspect in you. Something that we have inherited, the tradition. I am very happy that what Dr. Bedekar and his family inherited, they try to transmit it to the future. And then I'm quoting here. Recently when I went to Istanbul for a world philosophy, I purchased a book. The title of the book is Finding Space in the Political World. That is the title. In one place he talks about how a person can become immortal. Even though everyone is finite, we have to die. We live and we have to die. Even as we live, we can become immortal. It was so encouraging to me. That is, we have the concept of Jivan Mukti, liberation even while living. How is it possible for a person to become immortal? If a person who is born in a family, he may be married, he may be single, he may be a bachelor, he may be a spinster, doesn't matter. A person is born in a family, and the family is a nucleus of the culture. There is a culture in every family, in every neighborhood in the community. If, for example, the family in which I am born, which has got a tradition, which is a speaking tradition, if I could see that this tradition continues, not necessarily through my children. Supposing I am a bachelor or a spinster, I have got my brothers, I have got my first cousin, second cousin, even the children around in the community. If I could see that this tradition is allowed to continue, it doesn't die. To the extent that I contribute to the continuity of the tradition, to that extent I am already immortal. I don't have to worry about I don't have to develop the mortification of my finitude. I am going to die. But I seen to it that the tradition continues through my children, through others. Well, you provide education, you help others. That is the way one can attain immortality, not merely in the sense in which we speak about Jivan Mukti. It's a wonderful concept, but already we can achieve that. We can show that we are capable of seeing that this continuity is an ongoing process. And that's why we say that society, this is a wonderful concept by Burke. Society is a contract. Not a contract which you can easily break. It is an eternal contract. Contract with those who are living. Contract with those who are yet to be born. You are living. So there is a contract in all the three dimensions of time, past, present and the future. If you can do that one, well, that is the greatest contribution. You have a sense of fulfillment. You may not have that final assurance, a sense of fulfillment in life. It is that sense of fulfillment I find in Bedekar and his family, and all of you are assembled here on this important day, Memorial Day. Thank you very much.
We have unfolded various components of Indian traditions and heritage. Most of us, in fact, we've been going through this turmoil in our minds, like what is happening to the today's world. And I think you have put together all those aspects. We are really indebted to you, sir. In fact, the Pancha Mahayajna, which you have correlated, which earlier we were thinking that it has to be done only through the Purohits and other things. I think our management is doing wonderfully well this aspect of your lecture in the educational movement in Thane city. And you have given us lessons how to be worthy of living in a community, even though we have been doing it, and we are finding it difficult to maintain that with the changing world. And I thank Dr. Bedekar for inviting Dr. Subramanian for having this wonderful lecture on this important day for us. And Dr. Bedekar would like to conclude today's commemorative lecture with his comments. I request Dr. Bedekar to please. Please, Dr. Bedekar.
I'll give vote of thanks also. Thank you very much. Well, it was very unfortunate that we never met about 30 years back. But then I would not have read what I read in between. And now you can understand what actually these modern terminologies are and why we want you to learn them, understand them. Probably that will give you an opportunity to understand the perennial Sanatan principles in your own culture. What he said is absolutely true. It is very unfortunate that our institutions are not providing that vocabulary, that opportunity to educate our youngsters. I was very recently, my last visit about 6 months back in London, and in all those institutions there are continuous exhibitions on very important topics they go on. This time in British Library the exhibition was on all isms, modern isms. There was phenomenology, deconstruction, surrealism, Dadaism, Cubism and whatnot. And I was amazed. All those modern artists, writers, dramatists, philosophers, how much they have contributed to modern thinking. But then I felt, he talked about the phenomenology and the spirit. Yes, that is the title of Hegel's book I read first. That is a phenomenology of spirit. Probably the word he used first, but as he said, Husserl, who elaborated it, read it, what he is trying to say. Mind and body, or any dual things he says, the importance is given to the first one. And what happens? Why did they all started thinking like this? I told you they had a background of 2 world wars. These are all 20th century philosophies are trying to understand deconstruction. They had 2 wars. They have First World War and Second World War. These are reactionaries. All you may not understand, but believe me, what that movement of American movement of hippism, pop and rap. Go to the contents of those songs and you'll find that they are reactionary. They are reacting against the society there, against the decayed values there. So that's a reflection of the society. Maybe after 300 years when you have to deconstruct that, you'll have to understand what the American society was then. Well friends, as I told you, these are the terminologies which are not used only for philosophy. They have been used for every science, be it sociology, anthropology, language studies, physics, chemistry, mathematics, any science you name it, and without these terminologies you cannot understand. So try to understand them in original. Here in this campus, we have been, in this institute, sir, we have been trying, in the school we are teaching our students Panini. And we have a dream to examine them after 10 years. Is there any change, cognitive change, any such change which has been studied by the scientists? Will they be able to understand something better if they understand Panini well? Now this is, I am not talking about any patriotic feeling towards Panini. You can read, sir. I want to discuss with you that. You see, very recently Bronkhorst has written a late article in 2004, one of the most prestigious journal of the world, Indian Philosophy, which is published from Holland, and is written on Euclid and Panini. He has posed many questions. Of course, I know Bronkhorst very well. He is biased towards Greek philosophy. Doesn't matter, but he has posed many questions about Panini and Euclid. It is not the first Bronkhorst who has written, it is earlier Stoll has written, which he is quoting about Euclid and Panini. I am coming back to my teachers of mathematics. If the world is trying to understand mathematical history out of Euclid and Indian tradition, why not Indian mathematicians and physicists? Let them understand. They are challenging, deconstructing Euclid. In one of the interviews I was asking now 2 days back to the mathematics professor, Hashiri tried to know what are the elements of Euclid when they were first translated to Latin and what is their position. Of course, that was not an occasion. But there is so much of talk about Euclid as he has been taken as a god in our mathematical study. Excellent. He is. But deconstruct him and they will understand that what has been happening there in the modern physics. Was there any contribution philosophically, phenomenologically, by all those terminologies, to the Western science by Indian philosophy. You'll understand them, provided you understand what phenomenology is, what deconstruction is, what surrealism is, what modernism is, and what postmodernism is. Well, friends, with this, I am not going to take many more time. The vote of thanks, one word to all of you and all those who are involved here to make this function a grand success. Of course, to our great speaker, it is he who has enlightened us here. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. And the last one, tomorrow, madam has reminded me, at what time? 11:30? 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock, he will again speak on philosophy of Upanishads. I don't have to tell you that, please come and attend that. He is going to talk on the philosophy of Upanishads, something very unique. Well, friends, with these words, I thank you again, and I say that this function today is over.